Welcome to Two Bees in a Pod. I am Bilola.
And I am B. Leonga, and this is a podcast about immigrant experiences in the U.S., sharing our perspectives on various topics,
Including straddling cultures, fitting in, staying connected, learning and unlearning the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Welcome to another episode of Two Bees in a Pod, and we have a special guest today in honor of Sickle Cell Disease Day. So she's going to be educating us and telling us about her personal experience and her journey with sickle cell disease. So welcome, Ijeoma Azubuko. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank y'all for having me. I appreciate it.
And we always start our show with an icebreaker. So seeing as we are all from, West African origin here, the question today is, what is your favorite comfort food? So Ijeoma, for you, it'll be, your Nigerian food. And then for Bilola and I, it will be Cameroonian foods.
Yeah, so when you say comfort food, I would say that pepper soup, only because I feel like if I'm sick or something, that's what my go-to to help clear out my passages and stuff. So I would say goat meat pepper soup.
Okay, because I was about to ask you what specific obstacles in the pepper soup, but okay, yeah, goat meat, that's a good one. What about you, Bilola?
I don't know if this is comfort. It's going to sound funny, but I really, really like the house corn and granuts. And so for context, in Cameroon, when somebody passes away, well, I want to say mostly in the Northwest area, when somebody passes away, they usually bring it's a mix of boiled peanuts and corn. And they usually hand it around when people come to visit or even after a funeral. And so in the US, you usually find that at wake-keepings. And I was explaining to my daughter yesterday that it doesn't taste the same if I just boiled it at home. I said it has to have the flavor of death, but my friend corrected me and said it's kind of like you would eat cotton candy at a carnival, at a fair, or funnel cake, right? But it doesn't taste the same when you have it at home.
Yeah.
It's not that it needs. It doesn't need.
It needs the seasoning of grief.
But yeah.
For me, there's a lot, but I think I veered more towards snacks in terms of comfort foods. Plantain chips and chin chin. I think, yeah, that would be my go-to. If I was stressed out or depressed, I'll reach for that. Yeah. I think that would be my go-to. Yeah. All right. So I will briefly introduce our guest, and then, she's going to tell us more about herself and the work that she's doing. So Ijeoma Azubuko is a native of Houston, Texas, first generation Nigerian American, and she's the founder and CEO of the Ruby Ball Foundation, which we're going to be talking about that today. And it's an organization that advocates for awareness of sickle cell disease, promotes education, research, and improving the lives of people living with the disease. And Ijeoma herself grew up with sickle cell disease, as well as two of her siblings, which I'm sure, motivated you to or inspired you to do the work that you're doing today. And we'll talk about that. And specifically about how not just the physical aspects, but the emotional and psychological aspects, which I've seen you mention, in different articles where you've been quoted talking about that. Ijeoma graduated from the University of Houston with a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's in behavioral science with a concentration in industrial/organizational psychology. So that is, very high overview, but Ijeoma, I'll let you tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, where you grew up, and a little bit about what led you to start the Ruby Ball organization, Ruby Ball Foundation.
You covered everything. You got it. So I'm really impressed. I'm oh, wow, did that. But yeah, I did grow up in Houston, Texas. I am Igbo. Actually, my first time going to Nigeria, even though I'm Nigerian, it was in 2017 when I moved to Gabon for work. So it's funny because I met a lot of Cameroonians even though I live in DC, I met a lot of Cameroonians while I was in Gabon. But I've lived in the DC area since 2010. And I started the Ruby Ball in 2017 after a friend of mine that had sickle cell passed away. from pulmonary embolism. And so that was actually the catalyst for me starting the Ruby Ball, as me and her had talked about what can we do to become better advocates in the space. And so we were talking about it during Sickle Cell Awareness Month in September. Like, it was literally September 1st when we were talking about it. I was on my way to a sickle cell event that Howard University was doing. And so we spoke about it. We're like, okay, she was talking about writing a book. And then October, she ended up passing. And so I said, I can't just let that fall to the wayside. I have to do something. And so that's where I decided to find a sickle cell organization to donate funds to do something for. And so I also do event planning. So that was like my way of giving back. So I did a gala for sickle cell awareness that I attached to the Sickle Cell Disease Association of America. They have a conference that they do every year. And so although I was living in Gabon, I was planning the gala from Gabon, and then I ended up having it in October of 2018. And I was able to raise $10,000 that I was able to donate to that organization. And so from there, everybody's like, okay, you can't stop. What are you gonna, you know what I mean, do? When's the next one? And so that's what made me go ahead and start the Ruby Ball Foundation.
Nice. Well, tell us, about your early life, right? Do you remember at what point you came to the realization, or you were told maybe by your parents or a healthcare professional, like, this is the disease that you have and this is what it means?
I honestly don't recall, because it's something we didn't really talk about when I was younger. I just know that it's something that my parents knew from childbirth, I believe, that me and my twin brother had sickle cell. And it's funny because I asked my mom at one point when I was in Gabon, I was like, what kind of, like, what's my genotype, right? And so my mom, she didn't share any type of information growing up. So these are things that I actually just learned as I was getting more into my advocacy. And so funny enough, I ended up finding out when I was like in my 30s that I have sickle beta thal plus beta thalassemia. And I think my twin brother has SC and my sister has SS. And so it's crazy that we're three different people in the same exact family that came from the same parents with three different genotypes of sickle cell. And so these are things that I started learning as I got stronger in my advocacy.
So just to give our listeners or viewers some context, I think a lot of, at least West Africans, are pretty familiar with sickle cell disease. But for people who are not, right, it's a blood disease, an inherited disease, and it is quite common among people, or it is more common among people of African ancestry. And it's essentially a mutation that causes you to produce a different type of hemoglobin, which that has, various implications. It impacts the shape of the red blood cell, which is where the name of the disease comes from, sickle cell. And Ijeoma, can you just tell us a little bit about some of the physical symptoms that people may experience with sickle cell disease?
Yeah, and so I'll just go back to what you were saying to give like a more layman's man view of like sickle cell. And so like you said, sickle cell, there's various genotypes within sickle cell, but the main thing that individuals living with sickle cell deal with, like you said, the sickle-shaped blood cells. And so not only are the blood cells sickle-shaped, they're rigid and sticky. Right. And so because of the rigidness and the stickiness of the sickled cells, when you have a sickle cell crisis, when you have the blood and oxygen flowing through your body, they end up blocking your blood cells. And so now it's blocking the flow of blood and oxygen through your blood, which is what causes the pain. Sickle cell is very unpredictable. And so you never know when you're going to have a sickle cell crisis. And so with that, the blood and oxygen gets blocked through your body. It can happen in your legs. It can happen in your arms. It can happen in your chest. A lot of people that have sickle cell get pneumonia. And another thing is called acute chest syndrome. And so those are very severe that come about because of sickle cell crises that cause people to go to the hospital. So it can present in multiple different types of ways. And then just even talking through it, there are 5 things that may cause a crisis that people are familiar with, which are extreme change in temperature. So if the weather goes from it being hot to you being extremely cold, it can trigger a crisis. Altitude can trigger a crisis. Infection can trigger a crisis, hence the pneumonia. And so a lot of it is the respiratory infections and stuff that can cause people to go into crisis. Stress and dehydration.
Okay, I didn't know those. I did
not know that at all. Yeah.
So one thing that I learned a while ago, which I find interesting, is that the sickle cell trait provides some resistance to malaria, which maybe explains why it's more prevalent in people of African ancestry.
Yeah, that's something that people have seen. So, for example, how I told y'all I lived in Gabon. And so, one of the things that my job wanted me to do was take malaria pills before I went out there because of the likelihood of getting malaria. But somebody with sickle cell, I have a very, 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 very low chance of ever getting malaria because, like you said, one of the things that they've been able to see is that it's supposed to be a mutation that came about the sickle cells. So not necessarily having the trait, but actually having sickle cells. So then it came about as a defense to malaria. And so that's why in areas, not just within Africa, but you also see it within the Caribbean, South America, and then also in like Southeast Asia or areas where, you know what I mean, like where you have that like type of climate where malaria may be.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And there was a time where at least I knew the name of the disease as sickle cell anemia, but it was updated, right? Because anemia is only one of the possible
Yeah, and so that goes back to what I
symptoms.
said about the genotypes. And so when you think about sickle cell disease, that encompasses all of them, right?
Mhm.
And so there's SS, there's SC, there's sickle plus beta thalassemia, and I think there's one more, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. But there's multiple genotypes, and they present differently within individuals living with sickle cell. And they say that SS is one of the more severe versions of sickle cell. And so those would be individuals that you see in the hospital, like continuously, constantly. But again, when you have a crisis, the crisis doesn't care what type of genotype that you have. Like the pain is the pain, regardless of what you're having. And then I've also seen 2 cases where individuals with SC may have more complications as they get older. Example, like my brother that I explained to y'all has SC. He actually ended up having a stroke in 2018 that was aligned with him having sickle cell. And he's somebody that didn't really get crises when we were younger, but as he's gotten older, he started getting more crises that were putting him in the hospital, as opposed to me and my little younger sister.
That's interesting. So can you just explain to our audience, just an overview of how sickle cell disease is inherited and how that works?
And so with sickle cell disease, both parents have to have, it's hereditary, like you said earlier in the podcast, but it has to come from both parents. Both parents have to have the gene in order for the child to have sickle cell. And so it's not a guarantee that the child's going to get sickle cell, right? If both parents have the trait. But so, for example, like I told you, 3 out of 4 of my siblings have sickle cell. So my younger brother, he actually has the trait. So, example, if I was to have a child and the person that I'm with doesn't have the trait at all, my child will likely have the trait because I have sickle cell, right? But they're not going to have sickle cell because my partner does not have the trait. But if my partner had the trait, there's a higher likelihood that my child would have sickle cell. But regardless of if my partner has the trait or not, my child will have the trait because I have full-blown sickle cell.
All right. So if I can take our audience throwback to biology class. So it's a recessive trait, right? That's why somebody, can, if they have, and I don't know the letters that they use to denote, but I'm just going to use like big S and small s. If small s is the one that causes the disease and big S is normal, then that person who has those 2 would be, would not have the disease. But if you have 2 small s, then, you would have it. Today, right, at least in Cameroon, like I know that people kind of take testing more seriously than they did in the past. Like couples will go and get tested to see if they're carriers so that, they're aware. Do you know if your parents at the time were aware that they were carriers or if they had any family history of sickle cell disease?
I do not know at all. Again, like I said, it's something that they don't talk about, right? They try to make it as though sickle cell was something taboo. And so like even when I would go be in the hospital and a friend would call me, right? My mom would be like, why did you tell them you're in the hospital? So it's like I took that into adulthood. Right. So my friends would get so mad at me because they're like, why didn't you tell us you were in the hospital? Why didn't you say anything? And so because of the fact that I grew up feeling like it's something to not, you know what I mean, like really share with other people. But as I got more into my advocacy, I started seeing it as a part of my strength as opposed to
Mhm.
a weakness. And so because of the fact of not wanting people to see you in a place of weakness or have you feeling like they need to support, you know what I mean, like do something or you're trying to make them feel sorry for you, it's something that you kind of like don't really talk about as much. And so I don't remember ever talking about it. And then even how I told you I had a friend that passed from that had sickle cell. She was the first person that I knew that had sickle cell since outside of my immediate family. And I met her when I was in college because she went to college with another friend of mine. And so prior to that, I knew nobody outside of my immediate family that had sickle cell. So just going back to what we talked about in terms of individuals living with sickle cell and like the biology behind it. And so example, again, both parents have to have the trait in order for the child to potentially have sickle cell. But if both parents have sickle cell, your children will have sickle cell. And so that's one of the things why they want you to be cognizant in terms of who you're with. Because again, if my fiance was to have sickle cell also, our children would automatically have sickle cell because we both have sickle cell. But me being that I have sickle cell and if my partner had the trait, there's a 50-50 chance that my children will have sickle cell or that they will just have the trait. And so it's a 50-50 for either one of those two. And then let's say that, again, going back to how, for example, my parents and how I talked about how me and my twin have sickle cell, my younger sister has sickle cell, but my brother does not. So with both parents having the trait, there's a 25% chance that the child will have sickle cell and a 50% chance that the child will have the trait. And then again, 25% a lower chance that they'll be unaffected by sickle cell. And so like the last way of looking at that again, so for example, if my brother who has the trait ends up marrying somebody who doesn't have the trait, then there's a 0% chance that the child will have sickle cell because, again, it has to be both parents, but there's a 50% chance that his child will have the trait because he has the trait.
All right. So they would be a carrier, but then wouldn't have
Mhm.
the disease. Okay, that makes sense. So just going back to the taboo aspect, right? Do you think that's cultural, like specific to Nigerian culture, or do you think in general, like most people, kind of have that attitude or did in the past?
I think it's a Black thing. Like, I don't think it's just Nigerian. I think that it may be more heightened in the Nigerian culture. But as I've started to meet more people in the African American community that have sickle cell, I feel like it's something too that they don't necessarily talk about because a lot of people, when I started my advocacy, they were like, "Oh, I didn't know that you had sickle cell," or they had a family member that they didn't know that they had sickle cell until they passed, or something like that. But that's the reason why I have this shirt, or I made these shirts where it says, "This is what sickle cell looks like," because sickle cell doesn't have a face. And so I feel like that's something that people need to understand and to know. And so it's nothing to be ashamed of, right? Because it's a silent disease. And so because it's a silent disease, I want individuals living with sickle cell to know that they don't need to be ashamed. You can continue to live your life. You can continue to do the things that you want to do that's going to bring you joy, right? And so you don't have to hide behind it. And then also too, I feel that another reason why there may have been that stigma behind it is because when people think about sickle cell or when people see sickle cell, they think about those individuals that are in the hospital that are, very sickly, things like that. And so again, being able to see people living with the disease that are thriving, that are successful, that are traveling, that are doing different things, I feel gets them out of that process and that feeling and cause them to know like, okay, I can do, like I can live life fully.
Ijeoma, on the website of the Ruby Ball Foundation, there's a statement about sickle cell being a silent disease. So can you just explain what you mean by that?
When I say that it's a silent disease, it goes back to what I said in terms of the shirt, that this is what sickle cell looks like, meaning that sickle cell doesn't have a face, right? There's no look or feel to sickle cell. I could be sitting and let's say just even going to work. I'll give an example of like one time I was with my friends and we went out and they wanted me to drive, right? But then at that time I felt like a crisis was coming on because like I started, like I had pain. And so they were like, you're just doing that because you don't want to drive, right? And so not knowing that I'm actually like in pain because they don't understand it and don't understand what happens. And it goes back to the unpredictability of sickle cell. It could happen at any moment. It could happen at any time when you have a crisis. Also, sickle cell is beyond just the pain, right? It can cause different complications from organ failure and organ damage. And so, like how I said, my friend that ended up passing from pulmonary embolism due to complications of sickle cell. And then I told you, like my brother, how he had a stroke. So there's other complications outside of just the pain that individuals with sickle cell deal with. For me, I had my gallbladder removed. I was like, I don't really eat that bad. I don't have, like high cholesterol, different things. But me getting my gallbladder removed was because of blood deposit cells that I had no idea was something that happened with individuals living with sickle cell. Another thing, like my spleen, like I don't have a spleen. I didn't know I didn't have a spleen until one time I was in the hospital and they were like doing an ultrasound to try to like find, they're like, did you ever get your spleen removed? I'm like,
What the?
do I have like a mark like to show? I'm like, I've never had my spleen removed. And so because of the overworking of it, because it's trying to help fight infection, it can get to a point where it just disappears. And I'm like, I didn't know that. So just various things that you just don't know that come about due to complications from sickle cell. And then again, the fact that sickle cell has no face.
I think, again, I, had a friend growing up whose brother had sickle cell disease. And I think a lot of, at least West Africans or Cameroonians are kind of aware of, we hear crises. So we know the kind of physical, toll that sickle cell disease can take. But what are some other kind of challenges that may not be obvious to somebody who's not very familiar with sickle cell disease?
The shortness of breath, the fatigue. So like, I feel like the biggest thing, because I haven't really had a crisis, or I haven't had a crisis that put me in the hospital since 2020, thank God. And so, but the things that I deal with on a constant basis are fatigue. I'm always tired. And so that goes back to the flow of blood and oxygen in your body and what they call the anemia, right? And so anemia is something that causes people to feel fatigued. And so that's one of the things that I feel individuals with sickle cell like really deal with, and that is very challenging that people may not understand and may not get. So again, like if you're at work and you may say you're at a meeting, right? And the meeting, you're idle and you're not doing anything, it may cause you to like start feeling sleepy or like doze off. People think that you're just not paying attention or you're bored, but that's not what it is. It's the fact that you are fatigued because of the anemia. And so just certain things like that, I feel that people kind of dismiss and don't know, because again, it's something that a lot of individuals living with sickle cell deal with, and there's not really anything that's combated at the moment, right? So they have different types of medication that can help reduce the amount of crises that you have that increase the red blood cells. They have the gene therapy that's come about to help you be able to be your own, do your own blood marrow transplant basically, and be your own donor, as opposed to having a bone marrow transplant from a sibling or, somebody with your family. Things that have come about that they say are cures for sickle cell. But again, they're not for everybody. So even though there's things that have come about, it's up to the discretion of your doctor. And then it's also one of those things to where you look and you weigh the cost versus the benefit for you as an individual. And if, again, like how I told you, I haven't had a crisis since 2020. Me looking at gene editing or gene therapy as a solution to like get rid of my sickle cell, it would probably cause more complications for me, because again, I haven't really had that, that type of problems as I've been getting older. But there's other people who they may be great candidates for because it's crippling their life, right? And they're not able to work. They're not able to keep a job. They're not able to like tend to their family. And because of that, that might be something that they need to do. And then also too, with the gene therapy, they look at children as being the best candidates for it because they're younger and their body, they bounce back faster than an adult would. And so they actually look at gene therapy for people that are, I think, 18 and under, but more so adolescents and children.
That's interesting. So you brought up work, and I'm curious, right? Because, we're all here under the foot of corporate America. I wonder, does it fall under like some kind of regulation like ADA where your workplace has to accommodate you?
They can, yes. And so, again, it's funny because, when you're applying for a job and they ask you, do you have a disability? And so sickle cell isn't blatantly called out on there. But if you are an individual living with sickle cell, I would advise to check that you do have a disability because they have cancer, they have various things that are on there as a disability. And so if there are accommodations or things that you need to do, those are things that you should consider. But yes, you can get ADA accommodations because of your illness.
That's good.
I wanted to ask, when you moved to Gabon, did you have any hesitations about making that move, considering that you did have sickle cell and just, considerations being away? I assume you have a care team in the US that you're comfortable with and you've probably worked with for a while.
So it's crazy because I did not, but my mom did, right? And just because I'm an avid traveler, I love to travel. And again, like I said, like I don't let sickle cell define me and the things that I do. But I thank God that the first year that I was there, I did not have a crisis at all the entire year that I was in Gabon until I came to the US right before I was trying to do the Ruby Bar Gala. I was supposed to have a meeting with the charity and I ended up going into crisis while I was in the US. Ended up missing my flight back to Gabon, and that was like the first time. The second time that I had a crisis, I was actually in Gabon, and it was the scariest time of my life. I actually ended up having to get life flighted to South Africa because of the healthcare in Gabon. And the doctor that I had initially went to see in Gabon told me that I was having heartburn when I went to go see him.
Not heartburn.
I have heartburn, and he gave me like medication for heartburn.
Not him giving you Pepsid.
Yes. And then, because I'm like, I felt like I had chest pain, right? And so he's like, what did you eat the night before? And so the next day I go to work and my boss, he's like, are you okay? And I'm like, I'm fine. He's like, no, you're not. And he's like, he could see my face. So he's like, go home. And I'm glad that he had me go home because by the time I got home, I couldn't walk. Like I had a full on blown crisis and the driver had to come back to come get me to take me to the hospital. And when I went to the hospital, it was a nightmare. So like to say the least, in terms of the things that I had to do, I ended up having to I went to 2 different hospitals. The first hospital that I was at, they basically wanted the money. It was a money thing because once, like during the day, it was fine. And then once nighttime came around and they had a new medical team, it was a catastrophe. Like they weren't giving me my medication. And so at the time, I was talking to somebody that was there with the US Embassy and tried to take me to another hospital that supposedly the president of Gabon goes to. That's supposed to be the like higher hospital within the area. But keep in mind, he went to Saudi Arabia around that time when he needed medical treatment. So he was not there. So they took me to this hospital. The only time that they took my vitals was when I was in the emergency room. And then when they actually admitted me at that hospital, they didn't take my vitals the remainder of the time that I was there. And so just going back to the first hospital, when I was supposed to get my medication, they were holding up. They hadn't given me my medication. And that's why we ended up leaving. We had to leave. They wanted us to sign a document. They closed the gate on the car, scratched the car up because they didn't want us to go to the other hospital because it was a whole situation. And then end up finding out that the medication that they were supposed to give me or that I was waiting for them to give me, that they still ended up having us pay for, even though I never got it. It was expired. Yes, it was expired because I was in like a bag that they like packed up my bag and stuff when I had to get life flighted to South Africa. So long story short, ended up at the hospital, the other hospital. They didn't take my vitals for like at least, I think it was like 7 days. My mom was like, what are your vitals? I'm like, I don't know. Realized they hadn't taken it. And so then they finally did a chest x-ray. They saw that I had a respiratory infection. They wanted me to get a blood transfusion. That was a whole nother thing because my job didn't want me to get the blood transfusion because we were in Africa and then the blood. So they wanted to like ship the blood from Europe. It was a lot. And so long story short, I ended up going ahead and taking and then 2, I didn't speak French. Right? So like I'm at a French hospital. I have an interpreter with my job that's interpreting with the hospital for the things that I need. It got to a point where it's like, okay, you need to leave this hospital. And then that's when I had to get the blood transfusion. I think I had got 2 different blood transfusions or 3, I don't remember. It was so long ago. And then they got me on the plane to go to South Africa. And I overheard the doctor in South Africa saying if she didn't get here when she did, she would have died. And I feel like that was like that trick, that trigger for me where I was like, oh, wow. And so that doctor did not allow me to go back to Gabon. So I had to leave from South Africa back to the US. And then my job had to like basically pack up my apartment on my behalf. It was,
Wow.
yeah.
The doctor said you're not going back there. Said no, ma'am. That's oh my gosh. I'm sorry that you experienced that though.
And it's crazy because you, like you said, being from West Africa or being from, you know what I mean, like that part of, I don't even know that's like Central West, but you know, they have a lot of individuals that live with sickle cell there, but the hospitals and some places are not equipped to take care of them. And so that's even part of when I talk about people saying like, you don't look like you had sickle cell. I got that a lot when I was in Gabon because again, the healthcare and the system that they have, the individuals living with sickle cell aren't getting the right type of care. So they look sick. So there's things that happen because remember how I talk about the flow of blood and oxygen in your body and how it can cause pain crisis. So they have people who may not be able to walk because they've had such crippling effects in their legs because of their sickle cell and because of the crisis, because a vascular necrosis is one of the big things that individuals with sickle cell get with in terms of like their bones. So just various things like that just is part of the reason why I'm so into my advocacy. I think that also outside of my friend passing, that experience that I had in Gabon, like caused me to really lean into my advocacy and like push for it more.
Mm.
Hey Nanga, I don't know if you heard this. I think we talked about this some when we were planning the episode, where I think it's starting to make sense now. When I was growing up in Cameroon, I remember hearing that people who had sickle cell did not live past 18.
Same here.
And I think it makes sense now is they were probably just not getting the right care.
Yes.
And so they did not get to live long enough. But it was this thing like, oh, if they make it to 18, they're fine. You know, like miraculously they get cured. At least that's how I understood it growing up. And I felt like there was a tell for most of the people that I encountered who had sickle cell was a lot of people with sickle cell that I met their eyes tended to be jaundiced. You could tell from their eyes. And then I don't know if it's correlation, but like they tended to have like a distended belly. So it always looked like they had a big stomach. But I think that was also part of one of the effects of sickle cell.
Yeah. And so jaundice is a thing that impacts individuals with sickle cell. And what's crazy enough is if you start to see yourself being jaundice, that could be a sign that you're about to go into crisis. And so just various things to show you from that perspective. But in America, they used to say 30, right? Because again, going back to the healthcare system and for that. But I feel like there's so many things that exist now in order to improve the quality of care that people are living longer and the lifespans are longer. So going from now having medication that exists that are specific to sickle cell versus when they didn't have anything, because the first, I think it was 2017 was when they created a medication that was specific for sickle cell. And then even prior to that, when they started using hydroxyurea for sickle cell, they were using it in adults. And it's actually a chemotherapy for leukemia, I believe, that they ended up identifying and seeing that it's something that they could use for individuals with sickle cell. And so they started using it with sickle cell and they opened it up to being able to use that for children as well. And so being able to replenish the red blood cells with using hydroxyurea, it helped to like limit the amount of crises that an individual has. And so just various things like that started to come about and that they start, even though sickle cell is been around since the being time, you know what I mean? Like found out about sickle cell like decades ago. But it's just now when they're starting to come to the light and that it's actually starting to get the awareness that it needs so that it can get the research that it needs. And hence why we talk about the gene therapy when they say like, okay, there's a cure for sickle cell. And so really starting to really see it, like you saw how they talked about sickle cell on Saturday Night Live. And then there's various shows now that like bring sickle cell in so that people are able to see it, because it's not just about the individual living with sickle cell, right? But it's about the allies and others that have people with sickle cell in their lives so that they're able to be better advocates for their loved ones. And so the more you understand, the more you can support and the more you can help.
And I really hope, like, as you're saying, Ijeoma, as the science, is improving and being invested more in, I hope that that is flowing to places like Gabon and Cameroon. And I hope, obviously, like, they're doing their own work there to improve the healthcare, because like Bilala said, when we were growing up, it was like kind of this idea like, oh, once a person makes it past 18, they're home free, which is not true, because my friend's brother passed away in his late 20s. So it's not like, oh, they're just home free and they can live a normal life. Like, no. And then growing up, like, I also would hear people talking about like not remedies, but things that they thought could help, quote unquote, give blood. And it would be things like beetroot. And I'm like, is it because beetroot is red and you're just associating it with blood, or does it actually do something, to facilitate the production of red blood cells? So things like that we heard growing up, I hope that the science has also furthered in places like Cameroon and Gabon.
And so as research and for sickle cell ends up becoming more prevalent, I feel like it's across the world. Again, like, there's an app that I've been working with a biotech company to help recruit individuals to participate in a study. And so the study with the adults was very successful last year, and they actually went to go share that research in Abuja at a conference. And so I feel like that's one way of being able to show. And so the app that I'm speaking about, it actually allows you to test your hemoglobin at home. And so with you being able to test your hemoglobin at home, you're able to really know better in terms of like your health. And so it's something that you can use to advocate for yourself when you go to the doctor's office to go talk to your healthcare provider. And because you're tracking these things while home. And so I think that different things like that, and as a lot of these biotech companies are now in the space of sickle cell, and they're going into some of these different these countries in Africa, I feel that might be something that may help with giving them an opportunity to see what exists and to see what's out there, to be able to help with the healthcare.
Okay.
So it's not as good as it is in the US, but I feel like it's getting better.
That's hopeful. So tell us about the Ruby Ball Foundation, right? I was kind of intrigued by the name. Tell us first about the name and what that represents.
Yeah, so the Ruby Ball, what made me name it the Ruby Ball was, again, a ruby is red, right? And it's a precious gem. And so I feel like the correlation with a ruby being red and then a blood cell and sickle is like looking at it from the perspective of you being a gem, right? And you being precious. And so taking that and again, changing the stigma and turning around what people see sickle cell to be, and knowing that regardless of what you may be dealing with and regardless of what you may be going through, allow your light to shine, allow yourself to shine in whatever area is important to you. And so the Ruby Ball Foundation is part of that, is that gem. You're precious. And so giving yourself the opportunity to truly be who God created you to be.
So what's some of the work that your foundation is doing? You've already talked about, collaborating with this biotech company for the app. What are some of the educational outreach initiatives that you guys are doing?
So we do quarterly blood drives in Houston with the Red Cross. And we also, within the DC area, we've collaborated with Children's National Hospital to do various events. We had an event last year where we had it was basically for individuals going to college and going into the workforce, to be able to let them know like what resources are available to them, so that they can support them, kind of like what you were talking about with the whole ADA accommodations and stuff. So we had somebody from HR come be a part of the conversation. We had students that had graduated from college that were going into the workforce come and speak. So it wasn't just for individuals living with sickle cell, but it was also for caregivers, because it also impacts the caregiver, right, in terms of work and things that they need to do in order to take care of their children. And so doing events like that to bring awareness within the space. Part of the thing with the Ruby Ball is that we like to do events from a place of excellence. And so and also allowing things to not just be educational, but also fun to like draw people in. And we open up our events not just to individuals living with sickle cell, but to allies of individuals living with sickle cell so that they can be educated and they can have a better understanding so that they can help support their loved ones.
So when is the next ball or gala?
Everybody always asks me that. And I'm like, because the first time I did it, I paid 100% out of my own pocket because I wanted to give all of the proceeds and everything that we had to the foundation. And so as working through all of this, I'm having a nonprofit. It is hard when it comes to raising funds and raising money and then also finding that time. So prayerfully, we'll be able to do something within the next year by God's grace. But the next one that we want to do would be in Houston, because I feel like coming from Houston and being Houston an individual, Houston has always been like my heart and my place. And I know that we gather a lot of support in that space, even though we also would in the DMV with us having it in Baltimore the last time. But the goal is to do the next one in Houston, and any type of events and stuff that we have can always be seen on our Instagram, the Ruby Ball. So if there's anything that we have coming up, we can share that. And then going back to the study that I'm currently doing, if you know anybody in the DMV area that has a child living with sickle cell from the ages 3 months to 17 years old, currently working on a study. And so this is not connected to the Ruby Ball at all. I'm working with my consulting company, Journey 24, with this biotech company for this app called Ruby. That, again, it was the one I was talking about where you can test your hemoglobin. And so we're working now. It worked with the adults. And so now we're working with children to participate in this study. And so information about that study is on my Instagram, the Ruby Ball, and then also on the Journey 24 LLC Instagram. And anybody that participates in this study will get $1,000. Yes, $1,000 for participating. And it's something you can do from the comfort of your home if you have a smartphone.
Nice. Okay. So that Instagram again was at the Ruby Ball?
Yes.
Okay. And the website is therubyball.org, and you can donate there as well if you'd like to support the organization. So Ijeoma, what is some advice that you would give to a parent whose child has just been diagnosed with sickle cell disease?
I would say don't limit your child, right? Again, sickle cell is a part of my strength, is what I tell myself. And your child is stronger than you think that they are. And I know as a parent, it's hard to see your child go through the crises and go through the pain, but give them the opportunity to still be a child. Like, allow them to play with their friends, allow them to be a part of sports and, different things to an extent that they can. Like, talk with their doctor, with their healthcare provider to see what they're capable of and what they're able to do. But again, don't stifle them, don't limit them, allow them to thrive, because again, they will grow up to be amazing.
And what's your long-term vision for the Ruby Ball Foundation?
I really want it to be a space that, again, motivates and inspires individuals living with sickle cell. I want it to be able to grow, for us to be able to get the funding and attention that sickle cell deserves, right? So there's other foundations, there's other things I feel for other diseases that they get really good funding. But I feel when it comes to things that are impacting individuals of color, that it doesn't get as much traction. And so my goal with Ruby Ball is, again, we want to do events that are from a place of excellence. We want to be able to have the funds to be able to show people that are living with sickle cell that they can still thrive, they can still live and follow their dreams. So we want to be able to give out scholarships so that they can be able to go to the schools of their choice, that they can be able to get into the various things that are important to them. And so another thing that we do is around Christmas time, we give scholarship or a grant to families with individuals living with sickle cell to help them with some of the bills or things that they may accumulate because of the things that they're dealing with. So we want to be able to do more of that.
Nice. And I know you will. You're doing great work. So yeah.
Thank you.
hats off to you for that.
I mean, thank you so much for sharing with us, and thank you for being an advocate. I imagine advocating for yourself while also trying to keep yourself healthy is not easy, and you talked about the fatigue and pushing through all of that. So thank you for doing the hard work, even on the days where it feels difficult or you don't feel motivated, but just for keep going at it. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. You're going to make me tear up.
Yeah, Gemma, thanks so much for sharing. And to our audience, if you're following us on Instagram at 2B's Pod, YouTube, wherever you're listening to this, we want to hear your own stories. If you are somebody, who's living with sickle cell disease, or you're a caregiver, or you had a family member, we definitely want to hear, your experience, whether that was, in Cameroon or another African country or here in the US, because it's important, right, for us to share those experiences. So again, the website for the Ruby Ball is therubyball.org, and Instagram is at the Ruby Ball. So definitely go give them a follow, check them out. And if you're eligible, or your child is eligible to participate in the study, definitely. So should they just DM you, or are there instructions?
They can DM, and there's a flyer on our page that has details about it. And then there's a link in our bio that takes you to be able to fill out the questionnaire so that we can reach out to you to get you signed up.
Awesome. All right. That is all for our show today. Be sure that you're following us on Instagram at 2B's Pod and on YouTube at 2B's in a Pod. And until next time.
If you think you're too small to make a difference, try spending the night with a mosquito.
African proverb.
Right? I feel like that proverb is very apt.
It needs no explanation.